Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you, all of you, to the first VLACH lecture on heritage and resilience. Of course, it's not our first lecture we have at the VLACH Commission, but it's the first lecture in which we want to speak about this subject, this general subject of heritage and resilience of endangered languages. It is organized and hosted by the Commission of Vanishing Languages, which exists from 2016, and it has a clear objective: to preserve and to understand rich tapestry of linguistic and cultural variety that is rapidly fading away. Our esteemed members and scientific staff have dedicated themselves not only to documentate the languages and varieties, but also analyzing this heritage and ensuring that it remains accessible and relevant for both scientific research, but also for the speakers and the communities to preserve oral traditions, languages, and cultural heritage. So the Commission wishes to spot and prioritize the cultures and linguistic varieties that are in critical danger of extinction and an urgent need of documentation and revitalization. It wants to encourage public recognition and representation of the language communities in direct collaboration with the community members, the speakers of the communities, and to develop studies analyzing subject areas like inter and interlinguistic variation, language shift, dialectical shift, language variation, transfer, and all that phenomena concerning the disappearing of endangered linguistic varieties, but also cultures, instruments, carpets, whatever is endangered. We also wish to support the promotion of languages from inside the language communities, from the emic view, and to strengthen networks between the language communities. Today we start our series, which will be every 6 months, so the next resilience lecture on VLACH lectures will be in November. And we have the honor to open it with having Professor Yaron Matras as our first speaker within the VLACH series, who will shed light on the topic of multilingualism and endangered languages. Drawing upon his huge, extensive fieldwork and scientific work on the Romani language and its dialects, Professor Matras will offer us unique insights to these complex phenomena. He is renowned as one of the leading experts on language contact in the Romani language. Until 2020, he served as Professor of Linguistics at the University of Manchester, where he founded and led the Multilinguistic Manchester project. He also is a British Academy Wolfson Professorial Fellow, and currently he holds affiliations with institutions such as the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics in Birmingham, the Department of Hebrew Language and the University of Haifa, the Department of Linguistics at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and the Hanse Wissenschaftskolleg Institute for Advanced Study. His influential publication includes Romani, a linguistic introduction, language contact, Romani and Britain, a grammar of Domari, and an upcoming book called Speech and the City, Multilingualism, Decoloniality, and the Civic University. All these studies, also only some examples, have solidified in his reputation as an authority in the field. As we embark on this journey of exploration and reflection, let us open our minds to the insight that Professor Yaron Matras will share with us, and to have a conference which might inspire us to embrace the complexity of the multilingualism, advocate for the preservation of endangered languages, and foster a deeper understanding of the vital role languages play in shaping our societies. Let me thank you, and I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Professor Matras for accepting our invitation, to welcome him and to give him his floor. Or this one. You know, tamam. I didn't need it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here and very pleased to have the opportunity to talk about something that has interested and attracted me actually since my childhood. And it's been pretty much my life experience, I think, since I was born, including the bit about endangered languages. Some of my grandparents spoke them and so on. But today I'd like to talk about how multilingualism challenges our epistemological notions in relation to both academic inquiry and to social and public engagement. And I'd like to argue that multilingualism challenges us to take a critical view of the legacy of late Enlightenment, all these beautiful walls around us, and the early modern period, the legacy of setting an agenda for scientific discovery that revolves around categorizations and taxonomies and setting boundaries between entities and labeling and cataloging them and identifying their essence as fixed sets of predetermined attributes. It's an approach that is applied in the study of language, including the very way that we identify languages as independent or demarcated entities, how we classify language families and language types, how we perceive of boundaries between features that are seen as intrinsically belonging to one language or another, as well as even to basic analytical categories such as parts of speech, something very, very basic in linguistic theory, which traditionally in linguistics we tend to define in terms of their position in a slot in the linear unfolding of the perfect sentence. But of course we don't speak in perfect sentences. And there are other ways to look at parts of speech, such as how they serve as functional triggers of certain operational procedures that involve transfer of information and attitude in communicative interaction. In other words, instigators of action that is embedded into practice routines. The same kind of categorization project and commitment to taxonomy is also applied to our notions of ethnic and linguistic identities. The way we tend to link identity with language with place, and both with ancestry, and how we construct and follow and impose on others and on ourselves an ideal uniform standard of language behavior, which is tightly linked to a loyalty to particular power structures. The way we derive rights and obligations from such categories, the way we set boundaries on that basis between groups of human beings, and the intrinsic features and attributes that we assign to them, boundaries that end up triggering very often anxieties and suspicion among people and towards groups of people. Now, the world has always been multilingual, but present-day mobility, communication technologies, the complexity of social, cultural, professional networks make process of fluidity, I'm not actually repeating him, he was repeating me, make processes of fluidity and hybrid identities and practice even more sustainable and more conspicuous. We both embrace something that in preparation for this lecture we put together as a short abstract, hence the repetition, but thanks for the introduction. Many scholars in the social sciences and cultural theory, like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Arjuna Padurai, many others, have critiqued for decades now these fixed notions of cultural identity. They've linked them and their postulation to this legacy of Western European Enlightenment and often to the colonial enterprise that it accompanied. And they embarked on a decolonial research agenda, one that seeks to replace essentializing labels and ontologies and categories with an understanding of the more dynamic processes and practice routines that we find in reality. Social linguists like Ingrid Piller, Monica Heller, Brigitte Busch, Christopher Stroud, Ben Rampton, particularly the late Jan Blommert, and many others have adopted a similar methodological critique, similar in many respects, a critique of these fixed categories and categorizations, and applied it to notions of linguistic pluralism, so seeking to decouple features of language from spatial location and from nation-state frameworks. It's an agenda of inquiry that prompts us to pay more attention, once again, to fluid encounters, to floating features, to processes of individualized action and dynamic practice. And today I'll try to follow in the footsteps of these and other many scholars, and I wish to show how, despite the rigidity of some academic traditions and their application in certain forms of practice, and despite the regressive social-political developments in some parts of the world that threaten the advances gained in recent decades in relaxing boundaries between people and nations. So despite that, I think there's still some light at the far end of the tunnel, and there's a vision of pragmatism in analysis and of creative tolerance in society, a vision to hold on to. And I say this as someone who is in the process of recovering from a deep personal and intellectual crisis, a crisis that has accompanied the dramatic changes in work routines and connections brought about by the pandemic, and a crisis that has led me to embark on a new phase in my professional life after the country that I chose to move to and settle in some 30 years ago has descended into an abyss of nationalistic isolationism, and parts of the sector that I worked in during that period has also descended into a rigid regime of corporate control and permanent suspicion that is often accompanied by xenophobic undertones and denunciations that are a culture of denunciations that are threatening academic freedom and creativity and originality and the sheer day-to-day well-being of academic staff, and are making it quite possibly more and more unrealistic to use higher education as a platform from which to launch projects for social justice and decolonial reform of intellectual agendas. Now, Benedict Anderson famously coined the concept of imagined communities to refer to nation states and the fact that they're not just given but constructed, but are very much in our imagination. So we imagine them as entities, and as most of you will know, Anderson's historical analysis of the emergence of European modern nation states is tightly linked to the position of language. Language was picked up, regional varieties of language were picked up by regional elites, promoted to a unifying symbol of certain populations, imposed as uniform standards and symbols of identity, and used also as instruments of power. And that idea is with us. It's continued in post-colonial reality with the formation of new nation states seeking to embrace a standard regional, local, indigenous language as a symbol of sovereignty. And it transcends beyond even where there is no issue of territorial sovereignty involved. For many years, groups of Romani activists have been trying to rally people behind a standardized written form of Romani on the assumption and the conviction that it is only a standard language, and primarily perhaps a standard language that can draw and prompt the recognition that should be afforded to the Romani population, protect human rights, but also afford legitimacy to a form of political representation that hasn't existed before. So these ideas of a standard language to rally around are there even in the absence of territorial sovereignty aspirations. And they even go far beyond the nation states. The book of Nehemiah, it's one of the books kind of in the far end that you don't really get to unless you're a specialist, I think. The book of Nehemiah tells the story of Nehemiah, who was born into the Judean diaspora in Persia, and was then sent by the Persian king, Artaxerxes, or Artaxerxes, as he's also known, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And he did that, and he reinstated the observance of the Sabbath and other practices. And then toward the end of his book, I think it's chapter 13, the final chapter of the book, he says, "In those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, and you are not to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." So language, already then, and even in the absence of sovereignty, was a symbol of identity, a symbol of unity, a symbol of somebody's power. And of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition is very much shaped by the story of the Tower of Babel that portrays language diversity itself as a punishment inflicted upon human beings for defying authority. And this tradition lives on. In her first party conference speech following the Brexit referendum in 2016, Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, was trying desperately already back then to be optimistic about the prospects of Brexit and to encourage populations. And she said, "We will succeed because we have the greatest soft power in the world. We sit exactly in the right time zone for global trade, and our language is the language of the world." All of those are a product of imperialism and colonialism. And there's hardly any way that you can beat a neo-colonial and a neo-imperial narrative with such consistency. Her successor, Boris Johnson, a few months before he took over, said too often there are parts of our country, parts of London and other cities as well, where English is not spoken by some people as their first language, and that needs to be changed. So very much like Nehemiah, he didn't personally go down and pull out their hair, as far as I know. But in a way, it's worse because, Nehemiah complained about people not knowing the Judean and the Hebrew language. Boris Johnson doesn't complain that they don't know English. He complains that they know other languages that they use in addition to English. This has created a climate in the UK in the last few years of linguophobia, viewing others who use other languages with suspicion, viewing multilingualism and the use of other languages, even among people who know English and use English, which is the great majority, a tiny percentage, 0.03% who don't know English in the country. Viewing those who use other languages, viewing multilingualism as a kind of a deficient citizenship. And while it is not the politicians themselves who literally go out, curse people, well, they curse perhaps, or pull out their hair, others do that for them. This is on the anniversary of Brexit. Famously, a note was put on an apartment building saying, "We do not tolerate people speaking other languages than English in the flat. We are now our own country again." And the Queen's English, without an apostrophe, the Queen's English is the spoken tongue here. And if you want to speak your own language, go back to the country you came from. And this was accompanied by violent attacks. There were reports during the Brexit campaign and following it of people literally beaten up on the street because they were heard speaking Spanish, speaking Polish, and even speaking Welsh. And I say even just because, Welsh was there long before the Queen's English, of course. So the linguophobia doesn't see borders. Although oddly and ironically, the symbol of sovereignty in Britain is the coat of arms, which is written in French, Norman French, "On y soit que mal y pense, Dieu est mon droit." And that appears on every passport, on every letterbox, in every police van, in every courtroom. I've never heard anybody complain. There is also a Welsh Language Act, which regulates the status of Welsh partly in Wales, as well as government communications with people who want to use Welsh. But otherwise, no attention to other languages. Typically, government websites will say this: if English is not your first language, then find somebody who can interpret for you on the phone and you're left to yourself. An exception is what I might call regulating cultural behavior or cultural intervention. So this is where the government takes action because it assumes that in a particular community there are cultural conventions that pose a threat to the communities. The communities pose a threat to themselves and to the vulnerable members of their own communities. These are practices such as forced marriage, female genital mutilation, religious extremism, and these are domains where the government is very active in printing leaflets and disseminating information in the languages that they deem to be the languages of those at risk. Here depicted are Somali and Urdu, and there's other languages of particular background for behavior management. Otherwise, in the National Health Service, there is bottom-up some use of other languages, but it's not typically regulated. It is quite extensive in some areas of the healthcare in Britain, but it's not across the board, not uniform, not consistent. And during the COVID crisis, there was no regulated effort at all to produce information material in other languages. It was all done by voluntary sector organizations and supported sometimes by local authority. There was no government initiative to take a multilingual approach to all the COVID information. And so it's not surprising that there's a general atmosphere of suspicion toward multilingualism and the general assumption that multilingualism disadvantages people. And based on reports from the Department for Education a couple of years ago, the press was very much sensationalized the finding that in secondary school exams a couple of years ago, secondary school English exams, people did slightly better, and only by a decimal percentage point, slightly better when they spoke English as an additional language compared to those who were native English-speaking children. The percentage, again, it's a 0.8 versus 0.2, and you know how significant that is, and whether it has anything to do with the background or maybe accidental. It may be that actually immigrants are generally enterprising people, and the children of immigrants are very much pushed to prove that they're successful. So who knows? I mean, maybe it's not a coincidence. Actually, maybe it is foreseeable. But let's just assume that the difference here is completely negligible. That the surprise is there because of the assumption that multilingualism is always a disadvantage, particularly when it comes to English language, but also in other subjects. But look at the division here. What do we mean when we divide, or when the department divides, the government department, and the press follows in dividing between additional language and native English speakers? And we're talking about children who, with few exceptions, were born in the UK, so English is a language that they use either in the home alongside another language, or from preschool age, and at the very latest at school age. So they are as exposed to the English of schooling as are the others who don't have another language in the home. So this is a division about ancestry. It's a division about who notionally owns the language, whose language it is. So those who have English as additional language, they're not co-owners of the language that they speak, and they use from the age of 3, or in some cases from the age of 0, as early as they speak their other language. Now, a few years ago, we carried out some research in a number of primary and secondary schools in the Manchester area. We called it the School Language Survey. And what we were interested in is practice, attitudes, and proficiency in various languages that the children chose to tell us about. I mean, we asked them, what languages do you know? What languages do you use? We didn't label them. We didn't say native language, first language, mother tongue. We just said what languages and what they associated with languages. Sometimes the languages labels that they brought were Nigerian. Sometimes they were Pakistani. Sometimes they were more intricate. Sometimes several different languages of Pakistan were decided as different languages. Sometimes they were all perceived as one. We let them be, we let them do, we let them tell us. We didn't intervene. The school managements were partly interested in the survey because there is an official school procedure in the country called the annual school census, and school staff report on what they consider to be and label the first language of pupils at home. They usually only have one language per pupil, so they already underreport those who have several languages, or those whose languages they don't actually know about. Or also I can report from first-hand experience those who happen to have 2 other languages at home, but when they come to school are actually fluent in English, happen to be blonde, and are not called Sanjit or Muhammad. and those also are underreported. So the schools are aware, many schools are aware that numbers are underreported through the official procedure. So they were curious which languages and how many we would discover, as it were, or identify through this method. We asked children to name the language. We asked them who they used them with, when, where, whether they had any exposure to reading, to films, to television, to weekend schools. And we also carried out a proficiency test. It was a verbal test, and it wasn't concerned with grammaticality, grammatical grammar forms. Rather, it was about the fluency and spontaneity in responding to a set of communicative tasks that were arranged on the continuum from simple tasks like counting to 10 or naming body parts through to describing family members, describing events, and so on. The maximum score that could be obtained on the test was 12. I won't go into the numerical details now. But as you can see, we had children who had up to 4 other languages other than English that they named, and of course we tested English as well. And when you look at the proficiency scores in English, the highest being 12, nobody attained 12 because this is an average, so there's always somebody that's... they were as high as you could get, pretty much, for all of those who had other languages, even those who had 4 or more languages other than English. In fact, there's even a slight indicator if we wanted to, we could say that the more languages you know, the better you are in English to some extent. Not only was this, so there was no evidence whatsoever that the English was in any way deprived because they had another language, or several, or 2, or 3, or 4. And in fact, the proficiency if you take the first home language, was also relatively high, and also seemed to even rise if you had more languages. I mean, the statistical significance then gets a bit distorted, but on the whole, there was no indication that the more languages you know, the poorer your command of them is at that age. So this is, as I said, primary and secondary school. Project categorization, as it were, has been extended to various forms of multilingualism as we seek to explain, regulate the status of languages, and in a way that contributes to maintaining hierarchies. Even the interest in multilingualism, as much as we are, and when I say we, I mean states, European institutions, UNESCO, there's many, many international and intergovernmental and governmental bodies that are engaged with supporting languages and language diversity. And still they seem to fall in policy terms and even in descriptive terms into this project categorization, which inevitably leads to various hierarchies. So I'd like to just run through a few of those categories and see if we can propose an approach to them that moves away from just the hierarchical arrangement and seeks to understand these realities in terms of, again, processes and practices and fluidity. Starting with a term that I was using a moment ago, home language. When we did the school language survey, we did not label home languages as home languages. We do that in the analysis a little bit as we distinguish them from English, that is the common language. But we simply asked, what languages do you use? What languages do you know? And a home language is simply the practice, or I should say the reported practice in the case of the survey, but when we're observing firsthand, it's the practice of using a language in the home. We also had a more kind of problematic term before. We had the term native language and native speakers, native English children. Native means, of course, by definition, by birth, so acquired from birth onwards. And then you're born, and then what happens? Different things happen to different people. So the native is not a predetermined state of affairs. Lifespans differ and different influences come out. So native can be, of course, there is that perception that the nativity, if I may use that by analogy here next door to a church, the nativity aspect. I was raised in Jerusalem, by the way, so nativity as a whole. The nativity issue there is portrayed as a marketing tool sometimes. So there's language teaching schools that say, here, speak like a language, speak like a native, as if we know, as if there's a predetermined fashion of speaking like a native, based on the projection from what happened since you are born. Now in linguistics, of course, and many of you who are linguists will of course know this and have dealt with this in one way or another. Many linguists go out and record speech or look at texts and then analyze, what is it that we find. But there are also many linguists who make hypotheses about languages. And of course, these hypotheses already presuppose that there is a fixed entity called language X, okay, whatever it is. And about that we can make hypotheses, and those hypotheses are then checked by seeking what is called grammaticality judgments from native speakers. And there is, again, a hierarchical understanding that native speakers will have judgments that are more reliable than those who are not native speakers. And so it is their judgments that will verify or not, in one way or another, the hypotheses, the theoretical, the abstract hypotheses that linguists postulate. But of course, there's different native speakers who have different grammaticality judgments about different constructions. And there are people in the north of England, for example, who say things like this: it sat in the pub, or I've never saw one like this before. And those are perfectly grammatical to some people and completely ungrammatical to others. And that's what linguists have been dealing with for 40, 50 years or so, or longer, is the variation in language by region, by social class, and so on. We're aware of that, and that doesn't sit with the native speaker intuition philosophy. In Hebrew, what we might call the canonical structure for 2 kilos is shnei kilo, where the numeral is in the masculine. But many people use the numeral in the feminine there. There's a neutralization. So the feminine form is generalized for numerals, so people say shtei kilo. Now that can depend on the person's background, it can sometimes depend on the context, it can sometimes be for special effect. So grammaticality judgments among different native speakers will give different results. But I want to draw attention especially to this example. Native speakers of Hebrew. What does that mean? Speakers who have speaking Hebrew from birth. And as you know, Hebrew has been spoken from birth only for fairly recently. When I went to school in Jerusalem, half my teachers were not native speakers and made mistakes. None of our grandparents were native speakers. And we corrected their grammar mistakes. How many people here, other than speakers of Creole languages in the very first founder generation, went to school and corrected the grammar mistakes and the pronunciation of their teachers? But native speakers of Hebrew who grew up outside of Israel in an environment that speaks another language, for example, in English speaking in the US, it's very common to find a generalization of the feminine numeral in constructions such as Shavua Echad is the canonical, 1 week. Echad is the masculine numeral. And instead they say Shavua Achat, which most speakers in Israel, I've never heard this in Israel, I would assume that most speakers in Israel would regard this as ungrammatical if asked. And the reason is, an analogy, the ending A is quite often, but not always, a feminine ending in Hebrew. So there's an idea when you have limited exposure to the language, so more limited than speakers who use it as their only or principal language day to day, there's a temptation to have that analogy. Now, are these not native speakers? So by the definition, it's the first language that they hear in their home from their parents, and then from the age of 2, 3, 4, English or whatever is, the other language becomes more dominant. What is the native speaker? And this brings us back to this question of ownership of language. Who owns language? Who is entitled, or who is assigned the privilege, or recognized as somebody who should be able to say, this is mine, and I know what's right or wrong, and this is mine, and you should imitate me, and this is mine, and I'm entitled to hold on to it, or not? Are those pupils who go to school in England and have Bengali in the home and then English at school, are they not co-owners of the language because they also use it? They're also part of the community. There's a prime minister who speaks English now as a second language. You won't admit it, perhaps. There are also clear administrative procedural boundaries set by the concept of native speakers. Now, I understand that it is illegal or not quite legal in job adverts to ask for a native speaker of a language, that it is required. I understand that from various posts and media reports, but obviously this is something that was taken from a website for jobs just a few days ago, so they still exist. Although the tendency and awareness of the problematics of native speaker is to hedge it a little bit, so speaking to a native standard. But what is the native standard? What's the difference? The native person is somebody born in a particular circumstance, so if you take only them and not the others, then you may be discriminating. But a native standard sounds as if it's a qualification, but do we actually know? Is it a measurable or even a clearly recognizable qualification or skill? But it's hedged even further, so we actually find this acknowledgement that there isn't just the native, there is the bilingual speaker, equivalent, and equivalence can be. And there are even those who actually say explicitly does not need to be a native speaker in recognition that it is a complex world, and what we're looking for is a skill and not how did the German chancellor once say, die Gnade der Geburt? Do you remember that? Anybody remember that? It was in the mid-1980s, die Gnade der späten Geburt, Helmut Kohl. So the privilege of birth, so not so by skill rather than privilege of birth. Some governments use language as a gatekeeping tool in asylum applications and delegate often to private contractors. Some have in-house agencies that carry out assessment, and essentially dialect assessments. So they record people who apply for asylum, and if somebody says, I'm from Syria, if they are from Syria, based on the situation right now, by international law standards, they are automatically entitled to refugee status. And so the government's dilemma is, can we really verify that they are from that country if, for example, they don't have documents? And sometimes that verification procedure is carried out across the board, whatever documentation they have or not. The problem is that some very few governments actually work with linguists who are experts in the language. I know that the Swiss authorities do that, but I think most countries that I'm aware of in Europe and beyond, Australia, US, Canada, they have contractors, and the contractors need to cut costs because these are tenders that are advertised, and you need to show value for money. And value for money is brought by having people who are actually did not spend 10 years of their life researching and obtaining formal qualifications in the dialectology of the particular language, but somebody who happens to know the language and somebody else who happens to know how to write up a report. And this is essentially a cost measure. But over the years, attempts have been made to find a kind of a methodological justification, and there have been arguments. So already 20 years ago, when this practice started, linguists began scrutinizing and critiquing and criticizing methodological gaps in these procedures, and a group of linguists even formulated guidelines for the use of language analysis in these cases of establishing refugee status, and critiqued that, particularly that reliance on native speakers, as if native speaker intuition can cover everything. And they said the expertise of native speakers is not the same as the expertise of linguists. Skill in speaking a language is not the same as the ability to analyze a language and compare it to neighboring language varieties. And they also gave the analogy to a tennis player. Somebody can be very skilled in playing tennis. That doesn't mean they know how to describe which muscles are involved in that process. So in response, a group of practitioners who work with governments and government agencies went through a professional association and published this resolution that said it actually recognizes the contribution made by linguists and trained native speakers, with the latter working under the guidance and supervision of the former, to kind of supposedly give some kind of professional credence to that combination. And of course the question is here, what do we mean exactly by linguists? The agencies, many of the agencies working in this area define linguist as somebody who has a degree in language studies. So quite often it's somebody who is from Romania or another country and has studied French literature, for instance. I'm citing that because it's a frequent, there's a large group of people from Romania who studied French literature, people from Russia who studied anthropology and did a course on descriptive linguistics, and so on. So there's fragments of qualification, but not what linguists might understand as linguists. And then, of course, what is a trained native speaker? What training do they get other than the company showing them this is our protocol and this is what we need to follow? What does that mean? Once again, this indulgence in arguing that there are particular merits to the native speaker intuition are really, in a way, a facade for a cost-cutting exercise, because these companies have to apply for government tenders and they have to keep down their costs. Now, Verified is one of the larger contractors serving several governments in language assessment of these kinds. And they define this task as checking whether the applicant, whom they call the subject, speaks in a way that adheres to their expectations of the dialect of the place that they claim to be from. And they elaborate and they say the definition of the term adherence to the norm is the native speaker intuition of acceptability. So this is pretty much the opposite of what a forensic procedure is. A forensic procedure is something that, just like any replicable experiment, anybody who comes along using the same method applied to the same data should get to the same results. That's pretty much the opposite of intuition. But this idea is that being a native, you have a built-in intuition, which means that the native speaker analyst, this is a person working for the contractor, determines whether the subject's command of the variety is one that might be expected of a native speaker. So everything is kind of pitched around the native speaker. Now, there are already deviations in the process itself. Verified appends to its reports a short profile of the native speaker analyst. They're anonymous, and they give some indication. First of all, many of them have left the place that they were socialized in many years ago. Now, people's speech changes over time, people's memory changes over time, and whether they still remember how a native of their community speaks, or whether they don't, there is such a thing as partial attrition or convergence to other dialects. So that's already a problem. But particularly problematic is the fact that they admit that their native speaker analysts also are asked to assess other linguistically adjacent varieties than his/her native dialect. So on the one hand, the native speaker analyst is there because they have a native speaker intuition to assess their dialect, but then they're asked to use that intuition to assess somebody else's dialect of which they are not native themselves. So various people have critiqued this methodology case by case. I have taken part in various attempts to scrutinize individual reports and sometimes also file counter-expertise reports when people appeal against a rejection of their asylum request based on a language analysis like that, when we think that there are flaws and we think that the conclusion is incorrect. And in response, Verified has been rather, I was going to say vicious, but I'll say impolite in attacking and critiquing, including this from their website, which a few days ago was still on the website. Professor Matras denies the usefulness of working with a native speaker. That is outright defamatory. I've never denied. I've supervised the work of many native speakers, work with native speakers. I'm actually writing a book now together with a native speaker about his language. So there you go. The fact that he assesses Arabic, Kurmanji, and Sorani without truly being a native speaker, we have another attribute, without truly being a native speaker, they can't say that I'm untruthful because then they can be sued. A native speaker of the dialect or even language in question goes on to show that he ignores a crucial aspect of language analysis. There are also some juicy bits that I've left out, but you might want to look them up. Now, as it happens, I understand this is a multi-million euro, pound, whatever business, so the company feels attacked. As it happens, I can tell you that every single court case, every single appeal that went to court that I know of, where I produced a counter-expertise report, the appeal was successful against Verified. And I'll give you just one extract from a tribunal decision, just to show how the judges tend to follow. And this is, again, remember my remarks in the beginning about there's a light in the end of the tunnel. This is part of the light at the end of the tunnel. We are, just like in these job adverts, relaxing the notion, extending the notion of native speaker, edging it. And the courts in England so far as well, in view of the comments made by Professor Matras in the report, I am satisfied that limited weight should be placed on the report by Verified. In particular, the author of the report has no knowledge of Arabic. So this was one case of the Romanian who studied French literature, knew no Arabic at all. The two analysts were not assessing their own dialect. And this must limit their ability to assess the appellant statement. The appellant is the person who makes the appeal. So the asylum applicant who is unsuccessful and takes the matter to court. Further, there is no indication that either of the analysts have undergone specific training in descriptive linguistics or have any general awareness of the geographical distribution of structural features of Arabic dialects beyond their own. So the idea that there has to be a measurable, recognizable skill has triumphed here over the native speaker intuition. As long as the courts are still allowed to deal with appeals, as if you follow kind of events in Britain, and I wouldn't blame you if you find that too frustrating, but if you do, then you know that there is a discussion underway to actually take the whole thing out of the judicial system altogether. But returning to the native speaker, we do have alternative concepts. And the alternative concepts are, rather than essentialize, rather than generalize, rather than in a wholesale manner adopt this notion, fuzzy notion of the native speaker intuition, we can use a concrete breakdown of attributes. One of them can be the sequence of acquisition of a language. That remains a historical fact. You learn one language first, and then you learn another one. And in fact, just earlier today, I saw a social media post by somebody who listed how old she was when she learned, any one of something 25 languages. I found that very impressive. And there were several of those, so people are chipping in. So maybe we'll have a corpus of those within the next few days. So that remains a historical fact, so we can analyze that, the breakdown of attributes, including the sequence of acquisition. But that is not the same as proficiency. Proficiency can change over the lifespan, in both directions, or in either direction. The intensity of exposure to a language can vary over time and over a lifespan. The awareness of variation is a different kind of skill that you can have formally or informally. And that all relates to that question of ownership, which is of course not objective, but the claim to ownership is something that can be recognized and debated. So all of these are relevant categories, perhaps not a comprehensive, exhaustive list, but things that we can set against this fuzzy, all-encompassing, supposedly notion of the native speaker. I'd like to talk about just a couple of other categories. There are, as you know, in various political institutions, intergovernmental institutions as well as governments, status is assigned to autochthonous languages, assuming on this kind of assumption that we can easily recognize what is and what isn't an autochthonous language. So what's an autochthonous language? It's actually a historical discussion, first of all. It's got nothing to do with the shape of the language, of course. And historical is also always relative to something else. So there is some kind of autochthonous is, first of all, a debate. It's not an obvious, so I call it a practice. A practice is being the debate around claiming authenticity and status on the basis of a claim to historical precedence in a given territory. But precedence is also a relative notion. So Serbian was spoken in Vienna, I think, before Kurdish was spoken. So the Serbian autochthonous language relative to is Hebrew an autochthonous language of Israel? There you go. I mean, I grew up in a place where historical precedence, who was there first, is the big debate that people argue over and do more than pull each other's hair out, as you know. So this idea of the kind of precedence in historical territory, it's not a linguistic debate. Okay? It's a debate about something else. So what is very similar to that, and in many ways overlapping, is indigenous language. I suppose I didn't do a corpus analysis, so intuitively, a linguist's intuition. I think there's a bit of a distribution. Indigenous languages are pretty much the same. So languages that lay a claim, or where a population lays a claim, or representative on their behalf, lay a claim to authenticity and status based on historical or territorial precedents, particularly in post-colonial settings where there was European colonization, but not exclusively. So we talk often of Austronesian indigenous languages of Taiwan that were there before Chinese. I was asked, UNESCO has this decade of indigenous languages. And I was contacted a couple of years ago by UNESCO, who very much wanted to cooperate and to do something in Manchester, where I was working at the time. But they needed a justification to put it into that portfolio, so they asked me, is there an indigenous language in Manchester? And I truly didn't know, I've been in the business for almost 30 years, I really didn't know the answer to that question. What is Turkish an indigenous language in Turkey, as it's now called, it's all a matter of debate. So it's nothing kind of objective. And so the status to protect, I'm saying this because when we legislate or when we initiate or when we lobby for measures to protect autochthonous and indigenous language, it's not as though we can tell politicians or public representatives that, oh, of course, as linguists, we know what is autochthonous and what is indigenous. It's a matter of debate, and it's a social debate, not a linguistic one. Almost the opposite is the notion of diaspora languages, which is being used and kind of floated around in social linguistic discussions. A diaspora language is precisely the language that does not have a claim to historical precedence in the territory, but sort of acknowledges that it came later, and is surrounded by languages that were there before, or at least are more powerful. But that's pretty much where it ends. Some diaspora languages say we are the extension of a home language territory that is somewhere else, like Armenian. But others are diaspora language precisely because they don't have a historical or a present-day home language, so territory, home territory, home language, home territory. Yiddish, for example. So where Yiddish emerged, it is no longer spoken. Romani, we don't really know exactly where it emerged, but in any case, it's not spoken there. It's one of the reasons we don't know. And other languages that are, have been diaspora languages, actually by their very definition of grouping them as diaspora. So can we identify on the basis of any kind of direct external essential attributes what a diaspora language is? Well, I embrace here the work of social anthropologist Rogers Brubaker on diasporas, for example, who says, well, diaspora community is not a fixed entity. It's a practice. You can participate or not participate. You can participate some of the time or not in a range of practices. Language has never really been flagged in that anthropological discussion about diasporas. But if we try and kind of incorporate it into that discussion where it belongs, diaspora languages, you can say it's the practice of using language as what Brubaker calls a diasporic stance. So something that you do that sets you apart in a group of people, at least some of the time, from those around you, and has some kind of affinity to other groups who do the same or similar things or have similar compatible practices in other locations, so translocally. So it's a form of practice, not a particular language. And so the question is Romani a diaspora language? Is Serbian a diaspora language? Is the answer, that depends. That depends where and how people feel and what they do with the language. Often overlapping with that, and we quite often find languages that are referred to as heritage and diaspora languages at the same time, so there's no necessary contradiction. The idea predominating right now as a heritage language is the language as spoken by a second or third generation of immigrants. So they are native speakers, but their heritage language is their weaker language because they learned it from their parents when they were born, but then very soon they, through immersion with peers in school and work, later the language of the surrounding majority population became their stronger language. So this already gives us grounds to revisit the whole idea of native language, because here native language and proficiency in language are completely different by definition of that. It varies, of course, depending on the lifespan of individuals, which is why some of the more influential scholars working in this area, for example, Maria Polinsky and Silvina Montrul and others, have preferred to speak of heritage speakers, and in fact have called them interrupted native speakers for that reason. And so we can say that heritage language is in a way the practice of choosing inheritance. I follow social linguist Anna Doimat when she generally talks about heritage as choosing inheritance. And I follow a former colleague of mine, the writer Shina Kalayil, who calls heritage language a way of linking to community culture while evoking distance. So she interviewed people who say themselves that they don't lay a claim to be perfect speakers of Punjabi. They know bits and pieces, but they feel connected to it, even if they can't have a whole conversation in it. So they claim ownership because it's the language that they learned at home, or they connect to family and they've heard it all their lives, but they don't actually have the proficiency and on that. But we find quite an overlap with diaspora languages. I come finally to the idea of a very, very important notion in linguistics when we deal with multilingualism, and that is the effect that multilingualism has on the structure of a language. Now, we use the metaphor borrowing for that, So as depicted here, so English borrows the word mountain, for example, from French. Borrowing, of course, it's a loose metaphor. They don't intend to give it back to the French, especially not after Brexit, but even before. That it doesn't go back to rightful owners or whatever. But how can we work? What is borrowing really? Now, linguistics, modern linguistic theory is very much based on this notion that languages are systems, and each language is a closed system. And as de Saussure, the founder of structuralism in linguistics, said, un système où tout se tient, so everything is contained in it, and therefore language contact is one system influencing another. And that too is a metaphor, and I'd like to suggest perhaps not the most practical one. If we go back to basics, language contact is about populations speaking in different ways. And they come into contact for social reasons, and they need to interact. And what happens then is that at the very least individuals, sometimes everybody, sometimes certain sectors, sometimes it's unidirectional, sometimes not, but at the very least individuals develop what is a kind of a complex repertoire of features. Now you can't within that repertoire mechanically switch a language on and off, but it's there and it's present. And what these individuals develop is the skill to be able to maintain some kind of imaginary notional demarcation line within their repertoire, to be able to separate, select those features that are useful when communicating with one group, and deselect or suppress or inhibit those that are not useful, and vice versa with different populations. Now, of course, that imaginary demarcation line is a social practice, and it is permeable. It is subject to renegotiation and change as speakers change their linguistic behavior and say, not by conscious decision necessarily, but I'm going to use this form regardless of who I'm talking to. So let me give you an example of Romani, a language that I did a lot of work on, and this is from the speech of a woman who was based in Hamburg at the time, but her family, she was first generation, her family came from Poland, and before that they came from Transylvania, and she says, "Laki familia sas also que savesarte pina vartistulina." So if you've been to the north of Germany, you recognize the man, everybody recognizes the also. So all of these particles, they become an integral part of the Romani language. They're not seen as, this is not code switch, it's not conscious, it's not special effect. Everybody in the community talks like that within just one generation. Here's another. So we used to go to the woods and search and play, and we used to like play, right? So what does that mean? What is borrowed or not borrowed? In terms of practice, what happens here is that the demarcation line exists. Of course, they separate Romani from German. But there is a set of features which is exempted from that imaginary demarcation line. It's used regardless of whether you're talking to this population group or that population group in pretty much exactly the same manner. So if we go back to the process of borrowing, and what is that as a concept, in terms of practice, it is over time changing patterns of behavior. And it's by necessity a diachronic, a historical point of view, because speakers don't know, most English speakers don't know that table is a French word. It doesn't sound French. And so on. So it's us as linguists with analytical knowledge of etymology know that this is a product of multilingualism, language contact. But historically, there is some kind of trigger for selecting features from the repertoire in a way that is different to how they were selected before. What we as analysts regard as etymology and the source of the donor language. Linguistics, as you know, the founding of linguistics as a modern scientific method by the neo-grammarians of Grammatica in the early 19th century inherently features this idea of divergence of language from one another through changes in sound and structure, other elements of structure, allowing us methodologically then to trace back the ancestry of languages to a particular branch. And it's always the diversification that is in the focus and still drives much of the work that we do in linguistics. But there is that concept of a mixed language that has emerged around 30 years ago. And mixed languages appear to kind of challenge that notion, but of course they challenge the notion because they're framed within the notion of the genetic tree model. Otherwise it's not a challenge if you discard the entire genetic tree model altogether, then mixed languages are no longer a challenge. Okay, but the idea of mixed languages is that for various reasons they cannot easily be traced down to a particular branch So their ancestry can't be established in the conventional way. In my opinion, there's only one single language that has convincingly been shown so far to actually fit that particular purpose, that there's really an all-purpose language. Most of them are styles, but the idea of a mixed language is that usually and prototypically, and again this is controversial, prototypically they arise in a situation of multilingualism or bilingualism, and then the next generation creates in effect a new language, taking lexicon from one language and grammar from another. More or less, it's never completely that. Now, so-called Anglo-Romany has often been cited as an example of that, and I say so-called because users never call it that. Users just refer to it as Romany, but researchers have labeled it Anglo-Romany to distinguish it from the Romany as spoken in the continent, which has Romany inflection and where both lexicon and grammar are traceable to one ancestry, linguistic ancestry. Romany is spoken by English Romany gypsies, and it was said to involve a lexicon-grammar split, and nobody had actually recorded, there were constructed sentences. And I led a project for several years. So Anglo-Romany was cited as a so-called mixed language with lexicon-grammar split, but I led a project and we recorded actual speech in Anglo-Romany. And people say things like this, but anyway, I was saying to her, Jim, Kushti, Dadi, Dikkat the lover we've loved today, would you, how Kushti, I'll never suti Tarati with excitement, you know, in all this. And me mum used to say, oh my dear, Dikkat Lesti, Vata, oh however did that come to lel such a mush? Oh, what a Kushti chore, Dikkan, it's got a moy like a chickle. So this is obviously not lexicon grammar split because there's a lot of English words. And the Romany-derived words, of which there are maybe 300 or 400 in the repertoire, they're inserted by choice. She never has to use a Romany word, you know, and she might not. So this is really a style of speech which is there in in-group as a kind of a practice of using a special lexical repertoire to flag a sense shared of belonging. But it's the process really here that is of interest and not the final outcome, which is not rigid and not clearly definable. Related to that, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the practice of translanguaging. It's a notion that comes from language pedagogy and basically gives the kind of instruction in schools to, rather than take a purist approach and say we're teaching this language so only that language can be spoken in the classroom, welcomes the use of other languages as kind of bridges and so on. So I'd like to give you an example. In Manchester, where I worked for many years, about 4 or 5% of the population speak Urdu in the homes, but there are only 3 schools in the whole city that offer Urdu at secondary school level for qualifications, and that says something about language hierarchies. 2 of them are girls' school and 1 is a boys' school, and I had some observations there. Now, the language of instruction is English. Urdu is the subject that is learned. But, recorded the teacher saying things like, I will go around apne marking karne. Okay, I'll go around to do your marking. Or me bolunga, you listen carefully. I will speak, you listen carefully. Or any word you can't read, usko underline karo, and then ask me. So there's no easy lexicon grammar split. It's not a fixed language. It's not a mixed language. It's a style of speaking. It's a manner of speaking. It's a manner of speaking that really activates the full range of the repertoire to signal a shared heritage. Now, Urdu is taught only to pupils who have Urdu as heritage language. That is, they speak Urdu at home, or Punjabi, or Bengali, or Persian, or Pashto. So the definition here of heritage is extended to anything Asian, Western Asian, Southeast Asian, and beyond. So if somebody is of Danish parentage, they can't take Urdu as a heritage language. But okay. So I want to end with coming back to this idea of language ideologies and to show that there is a counter-narrative there. Some years ago, Manchester Evening News published an article about languages in the city, and in the second part they interviewed a friend of mine who was an owner of an Armenian restaurant. He had a wall in the restaurant that had welcome in many different languages that he asked his clients to say. And he was saying, he was quoted as saying here, when I came, there were not so many foreigners. It's changed for the better. It's a completely different narrative to the British government or the British opposition right now for that matter, or anybody. And at the top I was kind of loosely cited in a way about the number of languages in the city, and the heading was "Welcome to the City of 100 Languages." Now, I and my co-researchers were criticized by a number of linguists, and I won't say who, but for engaging in that counting of languages. They called it very dismissively linguistic accounting, demo-linguistics, head count of languages. The argument being that the number doesn't really tell us anything about the people's practice and how they actually use the language. Well, that's true, and it isn't true, because when somebody, and our count is based on various available statistical data sets. When somebody borrows a book from the library in Somali, that is a practice, that is an action, and that's countable, it's quantifiable. When somebody goes to hospital and asks for an interpreter in Bengali, that is quantifiable, even if they end up not speaking Bengali but Sylheti. But the request for a Bengali interpreter is quantifiable. And so on. If somebody on the census declares a language, it's quantifiable. So it's a window, it's a small aspect of practice, but it is an aspect of practice. So the act of declaring a language in some kind of institutional context. Now, in 2011, the government introduced in the UK a question on languages into the census for the first time. Before that, there was only information available about Welsh, and the question was, what is your main language? And so for the first time, we got information on the languages, but the question was problematic for various reasons. First of all, what is main language? Every multilingual knows you have different languages, you use them for different purposes. Is main the one that you're most attached to, the one that you know best, the one that you use most hours of the day, and it can be different languages for different people. The second problem was that you could only list one single language. And some people defined that, and they wrote Arabic, Berber. Now, I was consulted about problem cases by the Office for National Statistics, and they thought, where is the Arabic dialect of Berber spoken? I said, well, this is not. People said they speak Arabic and they speak Berber. But the mindset of the officials was so, because this is how we formulated, this is how we expect the answer, that's what the reality must be like. You know, and there is no space to and the third was that it was always linked to proficiency in English, so it was a bit of a taboo for many people. They thought that if they gave another language, then they would be somehow blamed for not knowing English, so they skipped the question. And we lost, of course, a lot of data. We tried to lobby, for 10 years to change or amend the question. We weren't successful, but the officials reacted. Now the Office for National Statistics has a very interesting interactive tool, and you can play with it, and you can see different combinations of different languages in the household. And you can already see through the heat map, so larger urban centers are places where up to 30% of people report that within the same household they use different languages, or different people have different languages, and that shows the multilingual reality. And that was the officials defying the politicians who wouldn't allow them to change the question in response to my lobby. I want to end with just a few pictures showing that there is a bottom-up celebration of multilingualism. That's not just top-down. This is a butcher shop in Manchester, and there's at least 3 layers here of communication, not disregarding even the pictures, which add the multimodality, another layer. So the first line is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and that is, of course, a blessing in Arabic, a Quranic blessing, and every Muslim is aware of it, and every Muslim can read it pretty much, and it appeals to the entire Muslim clientele, of course, indicating that this is a halal butcher shop. And then we have 3 languages specifying the products pretty much, so halal meat, or halal meat and chicken in Urdu, in Arabic, and in Somali. But then the organizational information is provided in English with some, idiosyncratic spelling, but for everybody in English, that's replicated. So this is not translation. This is not another language for people who don't know English. This is, everybody shares Quranic Arabic in this particular culture that the shop appeals to. Everybody shares English for organizational purposes, but there's also the particular identity. There's no problem at all spontaneously with the multi-layering and the multi-conception. Many shops and establishments use various languages symbolically. This is a shop, this is a primary school that says welcome in the languages of the pupils that they know come to that school. This is a student putting herself for election as women's officer in the student union. And this is Visit Manchester website that says come and celebrate Britain's city of languages, and talks about up to 200 languages. That's another loose interpretation of some of my research. So we have a kind of an atmosphere, a counter-climate with linguistic citizenship, to quote Christopher Stroud and Ben Rampton and others who've been working with this term. So this idea that you can use multilingualism as an emblem of shared belonging. In Manchester, the research that we did and flagging it has led to the city adopting UNESCO International Mother Language Day, as I kind of lobbied to call it Mother and Father Language Day, but I wasn't successful there too. But on those events, people like the Romani community set up stalls and talk about their language and make comparisons between their language and another community language in a bottom-up way, and sort of, you know, some people might call it reclaiming space, and if you're fond of that kind of terminology, then fine. But it introduces into the public display, in public settings, languages that are considered very low on the hierarchy and not usually taken into account. So there is some hope for a multilingual utopia if we are able to sustain it with research, with information and inform, and often counter-inform, because that information is not just producing knowledge, it's work to go against the attempts to erase knowledge and manipulate knowledge and fake news and all of that, and to put forward a notion of plurality in practice, both in society and in method. The image at the bottom is from Getty Images, but it's also going to be the cover image of my new book, which will be out next spring with Cambridge University Press. It's called Speech in the City. As Thede mentioned already, multilingualism, decoloniality, and the civic university. And there's going to be a bit more on some of the topics of today and others as well. Thank you very much.